it's really heartbreaking to see the situation of the people. A while ago I was just approached by a little girl and her first question was just, did you bring food? I hope you brought food to Fuad Kefraya and to Madaya because we are really hungry. And I believe her, she looked hungry.
It's so dangerous because of what's happening around us. Sometimes we go to places that there is a lot of shooting, a lot of problems, but I have to help them. This is my people, it's my country. I'm a part of them. If I didn't help them, who will help them?
دمشق الهلال العربي السوري وايضا اللجنه الدوليه لدعم المصالحه والتي لعبت دورا اساسيا. شوي خالي يلا خالي
115 لحضرتنا للمركز لتقييم الحاله من قبل الطبيب المناوب بالمركز.
Well, clearly a lamentable state of affairs there in Syria. Stephen O'Brien, you are Under-Secretary General at the United Nations. You are in charge of the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and therefore you really are very much a point person to try to help those suffering inside Syria. And you saw the last line on that film is, unless action is taken and taken very quickly, the suffering will just continue and get worse. So please give us an assessment of what steps you feel must be taken and quickly in order to help protect civilians from the myriad of dangers they face.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm sorry that I was late. As you may know, the plenary is running about an hour behind. So whether in the plenary or here, we're all here to identify and commit to a better protection and to find better solutions for the Syrian people. They are enduring one of the most brutal and savage conflicts of the 21st century. I think the facts have been often repeated. They just speak for themselves, and it's behind each one of those statistics that we are looking to someone's life having been extinguished, a young boy who's witnessed his father's death, killed in a bombing, a mother who's run out of solutions to feed her hungry children, a girl denied her dream of becoming a doctor. It's a familiar, sad litany, and the warring parties continue to indiscriminately bomb the populated areas and attack civilians in their homes. They destroy schools and hospitals, essential infrastructure, cut off people's supply routes, and seemingly with total impunity. And attacks on schools mean that now 2 million children are barred from being educated. And last year, we documented at least 112 attacks on medical facilities. That's one attack every 3 days. And 107 medical personnel were killed, according to health rights groups. Explosive weapons contamination continues rising exponentially. The heightening of human suffering is just jeopardizing all chances of peace and recovery efforts. An immediate effort to clear explosive hazards is imperative in order to save lives and ensure the safe return of displaced people to their communities and pave the way for recovery. But actually, as it happens in Syria, it's the law, the Syrian law, that anybody who's engaged in seeking, such as en masse, to clear unexploded ordnance, is actually a legitimate legal target. They are not permitted to do it under the Syrian law without being regarded as a combatant, something which influential parties could surely bring to bear upon the Syrian government to change. So we all know how Madaya and the pictures from there really shocked everybody and really seared into the collective conscience of the world. I absolutely pay tribute to the enormous courage and bravery of my UN colleagues, Yaqub and his colleagues and Kevin Kennedy, they're here in the room, but also all the partners and the implementing partners, the International Committee of the Red Cross, above all the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, who've also lost many, many people in the line of duty, and food, medical and other assistance is reaching them. But not enough. And this is with particularly the besieged and hard to reach areas where, however much we might have a Security Council resolution, we don't have enough of those. And even when we do get agreement, a resolution does not get you into a besieged area. You still have to go through the patient negotiations, the right way to get in with the quantity and the types of assistance necessary to meet the needs of the people there, rather than sometimes us thinking we know what they need without really checking in with what they do need, is by road, on wheels, with sufficient trucks, and negotiating safe, unimpeded passage. And as you saw on that film, it was a completely correct sentence. Access, and as the resolution says, 2254, but access, it's not a condition, it's the law. Unimpeded, safe access, so that the people who are getting into the cabs of the trucks, the people leading the convoys, are not deliberately or recklessly being sent into the line of snipers' bullets. So you have to have negotiations with all the parties. But when parties are habitually violating international humanitarian law, the use of siege and starvation as a weapon of war, we are calling that as the possibility that those could be war crimes. And that is where we have to be extremely clear, blunt, and recognise that whatever is happening in this ghastly war, and of course the best humanitarian solution is that the fighting is brought to an end, and we all want to support the talks and the resumption of the talks that only briefly got started in Geneva, but which I'm very keen that we should remain positive we can find a way to resume. But above all, we need to recognise that there will be an account. People who are doing whatever they're doing today will be held to account. That is one of the greatest deterrents to some of the worst behaviours we've seen, and certainly the most brutal and savage conflict that we've seen in this century. So it's clear to me, as we call upon the Security Council, and particularly the members with influence, particularly the Permanent Five, to put as much pressure on the Syrian authorities and all the warring parties to respect international humanitarian law and human rights law. This, of course, includes the immediate approval of all outstanding requests for inter-agency cross-line convoys by the Syrian authorities. If aid convoys today were allowed to proceed inside Syria, and this is only inside Syria we're talking about, we could reach 1.7 million people this week. 1.7 million people this week who currently are not being reached. But the bulk of our negotiations for access have not been granted. And I remind you, we have to have those negotiations, otherwise you have convoys who are being sent directly into the line of the sniper's fire from all sides. And then when you actually look at the number of checkpoints, very often, as was being discussed in a meeting I had yesterday, it'll be 5 of the Syrian government checkpoints, and then there's another checkpoint, and then there are 2 by Hezbollah. You have to negotiate to get through all of them. And that's why, on protection, on making sure that we recognise that this is the ultimate goal, is to protect civilians in conflict situations, as well as to get their humanitarian supplies, because without that, we will get no access. And as I say, and would repeat, access is the law. It is not conditional, but certainly we need to see real progress on this very fast. Otherwise, the context by which there is any confidence for the warring parties to resume talks will be difficult to achieve.
Stephen O'Brien, thank you so much indeed for reminding us about the terrible violations of both human rights and humanitarian law in Syria and the kind of pressure that you believe must be applied. Gráinne O'Hara, you are head of protection at the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. And perhaps you'd be so kind as to just highlight for us briefly the kind of threats that civilians face inside Syria.
Certainly.
Oh, you're there. I was looking at that table, two top tables. Thank you. Do you want... That's fine. Have you got a microphone? Do you want to stand, or are you happier sitting? It may be easier to project if you stand.
I will stand, then people can see me clearly and also hear me clearly. Thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to speak here. I work for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, but in the context I'm speaking today, I speak on behalf of and in representation of the entire protection sector and all of the UN agencies and civil society actors that participate there. Protection is a word that's thrown around very lightly and liberally, and it means all things to everyone. Sometimes it's a confusing concept to grasp. We in the protection sector understand our interventions to be characterized in three specific dimensions: physical protection, material protection, which refers to the assistance that people need, and also legal protection. And we consider all three of these dimensions to be fundamentally important. Of course, and without wanting to put protection interventions into any hierarchy, I think we can all agree that in terms of the physical protection that Syrians need, there is an unquestioned consensus now around the importance of a cessation of conflict, and related to that, an opening up of access that would allow all of us much greater scope in our work to reach a greater number of Syrians with a much broader range of services. In the protection sector, we organise ourselves roughly along 4 thematic areas of intervention. We are concerned around the issues of gender and sexual-based violence, to which others will speak more directly. Also child protection, to which others more expert than I will speak later. We also have a direct area of focus around issues of housing, land and property, which are fundamental to the prospects of return. And lastly, mine action, to which Mr. O'Brien has spoken very eloquently and passionately about the restrictions that our colleagues in the Mine Action Service face. Notwithstanding, there are still mine action interventions that can take place and which critically need your funding even before we move to the possibility of mine clearance. There is huge work that can be done in mine risk education, which is fundamentally an important aspect of protection for Syrians. Yes, the cessation of violence and the increase of access, fundamentally important all round. And as we incrementally try to open up more space in Syria, whether it's through localized peace agreements, temporary cessations of conflict, the access of convoys, it's very important that protection actors are very closely involved in all of that, because as we open up and expand access, it's important to ensure that positive prospects like localized ceasefires do not spill over into negative protection implications, like seeing people going from theoretically being liberated to almost automatically going into arbitrary detention. So it is very important that protection actors are very closely involved in all of these developments. I will say one word in closing on the whole area of civil documentation, noting that others will speak to other protection concerns. We consider civil documentation to be a fundamentally important protection intervention. And some may scratch their heads and think, why is she talking about civil documentation in a context where bombs are falling? If and when access expands and as areas in Syria are pacified, civil registration is fundamentally important to allow people to rebuild their lives. People need documentation in order to secure their freedom of movement, to get through checkpoints without being hindered, and also to have access to services. And civil registration is also fundamentally important from the moment of birth for all those children that continue to be born in this context of conflict. They need their birth to be registered. We need to ensure that they do not start out life as stateless and almost as non-existent persons, and they will need those documents in order to access services. I shall leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Grania O'Hara. And may I respectfully request all the speakers I call on to speak to please keep their comments as brief as possible, because I have at least a dozen speakers, and 1:30 is 1:30, and I cannot make it more elastic than that. So please, I ask you respectfully. Salma Kahali, you are Syrian, and of course some of the most vulnerable groups are children. Great,
Yes.
A lot of worries about them joining armed groups and so on. Just tell us about the needs of the children.
Yeah, I just came, I'll speak briefly. I would like to focus on the 14 to 18-year-olds in particular, because all children are definitely vulnerable, and with the continuing violence, all efforts are, are limited in what they can do. I think the 14 to 18-year-olds, young people, have very little. Have very little opportunities to actually engage in their communities constructively, and we see a lot of risks to that group, whether that's engagement in armed groups or early marriage. And I think but there are quite a few local initiatives that are being done to actually support young people, and unfortunately, these are not being supported by the UN more generally. They're not being taken up and being done on a bigger scale. We see a lot of timid programming by the UN, particularly things like child-friendly spaces and limited psychosocial support. And we need, I think, given the big risks that young people are facing, we need stronger and more creative programming in order to access these youths and support them.
We salute your efforts, and we wish you all the best in your efforts. Thank you very much indeed, Salma. Zainab Bangura, you are the United Nations Special Representative on Sexual Violence in Conflict, and sexual violence and exploitation, of course, is a critical issue.
Thank you very much. I think, as we're all aware, sexual violence has been systematically used by all parties throughout the conflict in Syria as a tactic of war, as a tactic of terrorism and torture against women, men, boys and girls, including minorities on the basis of their religion, ethnicity or sexual orientation. Women and girls particularly have been vulnerable in the context of house-to-house searches at checkpoints, in detention facilities, and at border crossing. And so my wish today is I hope that in the course of when we go into concrete discussion in Syria, and I think I agree with Stevens who mentioned my greatest wish is to ensure that there is accountability. Whatever we do in Syria, if we don't ensure accountability, I don't think we're able to bring peace. During my last visits to Syria and to the neighboring countries hosting millions of refugees, I heard from many of the men and women I spoke to that a weak link is the lack of adequate services, including medical and psychosocial support to victims of sexual violence. Therefore, I hope that in the course of our discussion today, partners will be able to ensure that they commit adequate resources to address this problem. I would also like to commend, of course, like everybody, the neighboring countries of Jordan, Turkey, and Europe that is receiving refugees. But my appeal to all of these countries, especially the Europeans who are receiving the refugees and the neighboring countries, is one, to ensure that in the course of asylum process, survivors of sexual violence can get prioritized and provided with adequate services, including medical and psychosocial. Second, to ensure that the victims of sexual violence are kept together with their families to alleviate their trauma and ensure their quick integration. Three, to ensure that unaccompanied children seeking refuge are well documented and protected so that they do not fall prey to sexual traffickers and other criminal gangs. And finally, it is very crucial for accountability purposes that while granting safe haven to refugees, asylum states also provide avenues for justice to all the perpetrators of crimes such as sexual violence. Justice for victims of sexual violence in Syria may be delayed, but ultimately it must not be denied. We must ensure accountability and seek justice for those men and women who have been sexually abused in the conflict in Syria. Thank you.
Yeah, picking up what Stephen O'Brien there said about no impunity. Thank you very much indeed, Zainab Bangura. Fadi Halissu, you are an NGO active, I believe, mostly with refugees in Lebanon and Jordan, but you've also been part of the NGO Day run-up to this conference. So just perhaps give us your brief observations, please. I see a lot of sheets there, Fadi.
I will be brief. So the NGOs and the Syrian civil society yesterday expressed their deep frustration from the failure of the international community to protect civilians in Syria, especially to protect schools and hospitals from being targeted, our infrastructure who is being destroyed. There was a deep concern also that protection could not be separated from other sectors like livelihood. For instance, depriving Syrian refugees from the right to work in the surrounding countries would lead to the abuse, to child labor, to sex trafficking too. So there are also voices who were concerned about the support for the Syrian organizations in areas of Syria that are inaccessible for international organizations. We need more support to those organizations, more capacity building for them to do the work they are doing on the ground, more help for the medical, more help and support for the medical sector. The issue of access for besieged area was a major one. We asked not for occasional convoys, but to secure open, sustainable, and long-term access, and removing the use of starvation and siege as a weapon of war. There were other voices who were asking for the establishment of safe zones inside Syria that could be out of the struggle. That's all.
Well, it sounds like you had a lot of very fruitful discussions and seemed to have come out with a very coordinated, unified message. So it was a good day. Yeah. Yeah.
Actually, we had a very good statement that is going to be released and sent to the world leaders attending this conference. And we were very glad that for the first time we've seen that Syrians are involved in this conference and in the preparation for this. We would like to encourage this, and we ask for more interactive role and proactive role for the Syrian civil actors in the planning and the decision-making around Syria and the response to Syria, the Syrian crisis.
Thank you. The decision-makers are listening. Thank you very much indeed, Fadi. European Union Commissioner Christos Stylianidis, Yasis, again. Thank you very much. Of course, you're Humanitarian and Crisis Management Commissioner for the European Union.
Thank you so much.
Briefly, thank you. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Dear colleagues, dear friends, it's a privilege to be here today as a part of the humanitarian family, and in particular with some of real heroes on the ground. Thank you so much for this. Stephen has already given us some shocking figures of suffering, of destruction, and some of you already given us this shocking situation on the ground. Today, the European Union made a substantial pledge of at least 3 billion euros for the current year, 2016. But the lives saved by this money unfortunately get wasted by the lack of protection and international humanitarian law violations. This is the reality on the ground. We have an obligation to do all we can to protect the Syrian people. But to protect Syrian people, it's must to protect humanitarian and health workers on the ground. This is the real thing about access. I would like to focus and to emphasize on two areas where the impact of the lack of protection is most striking, and this is, as you know, health and children. I'm coming from the medical profession, and I know very well what it means without doctors and without facilities in medical care. Systematic assaults on medical professional facilities and patients have broken Syria's health system, making it nearly impossible to receive essential medical care. More than every second hospital has been severely damaged. Nearly half of Syrian doctors have fled the country. Large parts of Syria are almost completely cut off from any medical assistance. This is the situation about medical. Children, the second one, are the main victims of this war. All of us have seen the faces of Madaya, and unfortunately, there are too many Madayas across Syria. This is the reality. Okay. More than half of Syria's school-age children are out of school. And I think attacks on schools continue daily. This must stop now. And this is our moral obligation. We have collective responsibility to provide these children education. This is why I made education in emergencies one of my major priorities. And I'm proud that as European Commission will meet the UN target of 10% in education in emergencies already this year. I also, and this is my promise, I intend to promote together with UNICEF education in emergency project in different parts of Syria, inside Syria, focusing on non-formal initiatives. This is just the beginning, my dear friends. We must do more, and we must do it together. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much indeed, Commissioner. Thank you for that very vital perspective from the European Union. Now, a major donor in humanitarian affairs, the United States, Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugees and Migration, Anne Richard, if you could give us your brief comments, please, on the US effort.
Thank you very much. And looking out at this audience, obviously, there are many, many experts here, so I'll just try to be brief, and perhaps we can put longer statements on our websites. I want to thank the organizers, of course, and coming from the State Department's Refugee Bureau, protection of civilians is at the center of what we do every day. The crisis resulting from the conflict in Syria requires unprecedented support from all of us. And just this morning, Secretary of State Kerry announced over $900 million in assistance, $600 million of humanitarian assistance, building on what we gave last year, and then another more than $300 million of development assistance for the education of local and Syrian children in Jordan and Lebanon. The conflict in Syria presents us with daunting challenges, some of which the humanitarian agencies have the tools and expertise to meet, and others that can only be resolved by a political solution to the crisis. And when the Secretary left the plenary this morning, he resolved that to continue to pursue this political solution to the crisis. In the meantime, it is imperative that we do more for the Syrian people who every day face death or injury from the indiscriminate use of weapons and airstrikes. It is contrary to international humanitarian law to starve civilians as a tactic of war. We must find a way to stop the use of siege tactics and to reach innocent people who remain trapped. Civilians must be free to leave besieged areas, and we are grateful to Stephen O'Brien and OCHA for keeping track of where the people are. 4.6 million people in hard-to-reach and besieged communities, more than 486,000 people living in besieged areas. Protection can be a complicated term, meaning different things to different people, but there should be no doubt that protection of vulnerable people underpins all humanitarian action. Physical safety from fighting is one form of protection, but so is ensuring that all children have birth certificates and citizenship at birth, as my long-lost cousin Grania has already said today. Parents or responsible guardians should care for children and send them to school. They should not be forced or feel forced to send them to work or fight in wars. Women should not face the threat of sexual violence just crossing a checkpoint to buy food for their families. We know gender-based violence occurs whenever societal structures break down, so we must seek to prevent violence before it occurs and help survivors when it does occur. Another form of protection is providing the vulnerable with food, medicine, and shelter. It also means working with community-based networks inside Syria and in countries of asylum to help identify and assist those who need help. Just a quick word on stabilization before getting to the next session. A political solution to this conflict will only be durable if the lives of Syrians improve. Support to stabilize Syria in the immediate term should be focused on ending indiscriminate violence, siege tactics, denial of aid, increasing humanitarian access, restoring basic services, and maintaining a ceasefire in order to create space for a durable political transition. One of the things that came out of the discussions with NGOs yesterday, all assistance must be tailored to meet the needs of communities as articulated by the Syrians who live there, working through existing local governance structures to help meet these needs. Just a final word here at the table with the leader of the Syria Recovery Trust Fund. With its vast experience, technical expertise, and connections inside Syria, we see the Syria Recovery Trust Fund as a vital part of these efforts as we move forward. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. A brief word from Earthrine Cousin, Executive Director of World Food Programme. Obviously, we also...
I promise it'll be brief.
We saw all the pictures of the starving, besieged populations, so really what we're doing to try to remedy that.
Thank you very much. And since this crisis began, WFP's fed between 3.9 and 4.1 million people inside Syria every single month. And that is in spite of the fact of what the numbers that you've heard from Stephen and others today about what is besieged and where they're besieged. And those people that we feed every month, the challenge that we've had historic for the past 5 years has been lack of funds. What I'm excited about, and I want to take this opportunity, is to say thank you to all the donors who are attending this meeting. You heard Angela Merkel this morning say that she is committing 772 million euros to WFP, and she, in a meeting with me, also said she is committed to leaving here only when WFP is fully funded. And so we know that some of the negative coping strategies that women and children have been forced into inside Syria because we have not had the money to provide the food, we can overcome in 2016. We can address the challenges of providing fresh food and vegetables to pregnant and lactating women who are trapped inside Syria. We can provide education money in programs for school meals to get children to go to school because they know that they'll have a nutritious meal. We'll do that this year in 2016. But the challenge is there are, as you've heard, 4.5 million people who we can't reach. The money won't help us access those people. It won't overcome the negative coping strategies that the anecdotal evidence tells us that women are going through to provide food for their children. So I want to close by saying thank you for what you've done, but we must have the political solutions that will ensure that the protection issues that we all agree we must address, that we can address, because we can serve every person who is affected by this conflict.
Thank you very much indeed, Earthrine Cousin. Just a brief response to what you've heard Stephen O'Brien there, that, you know, even with resources and the will and so on, if you can't get to 4.5 million, it's very difficult.
Well, I'm not actually going to touch, inevitably, I was given some prepared remarks. I mean, we've just heard in the room exactly what protection means. It means that if you've got fighting, you've got a complete derogation of duty of people who should be in the business of protecting civilians being missed. And therefore it is up to the rest of us, whether it's to do with infrastructure, people, sexual violence, all that Earthrine has just said. This is fundamental, not just to make sure we get life-saving to people, but we should always say life-saving and protection. It is part of what we have to do. That's why you have to think about what is it that is going to most deter those who are causing the problem, whether it's an access problem, using siege as a weapon of war. And most of it is to do, in the end, with making sure people know that they will be called out. The world will object. The world will be very, very concerned and angry and want to see an account held. That is, above all, the only way you can get past the terrible behaviours which cause people to think when they're in the middle of a fight that they can win the fight, rather than recognising that nobody wins a military conflict. It can only be done by political and diplomatic means. It's why we have to all support what political processes we can urgently to get to the result But whether it's to do with refugees or people inside a country of conflict, whether it's to do with medical, above all, in the end, it's the people are the most vulnerable. And we heard that from the 14 to 18-year-olds who are most vulnerable in one sense, women with the coping strategies in another, children who can't go to school. It's not just that they're robbed of hope. It's the fact that their lives are cheap and not regarded as being as valuable and as huge as each and every one of us. And it's that which we have to commit to. So I think it's really clear. And maybe the World Humanitarian Summit, which is coming up in May, can reinforce, re-inspire people to get behind this as part of the common mission we all have to deliver on our common humanity at the same time as we deliver on the enormous and important life-saving commodities and the psychosocial social support, which I thought was a very powerful point that was mentioned.
Stephen O'Brien, thank you very much indeed. And in fact, that brings us to our next speaker, and you can sort of act as a bridge, if you'd be so kind, Joyce Anale, to act as a bridge between protection and stabilisation and why we need to think about stabilisation. You are a Foreign Office Minister with special responsibility for human rights. You speak to Foreign Affairs in the House of Lords. Here, you're also a special representative on sexual violence, although, of course, we have heard from Zainab Bangura about that. But perhaps you could just give us your perspective on what you've heard on protection and then just lead us into why we need to think about stabilisation.
And Stephen was right in saying, as the audience as well, the solution lies in politicians' hands. It means that if we have a political solution, then we can get access for the humanitarian aid and be able to assist in supporting Syria. But of course, if we're talking about a political solution, it means there has to be the will to do it. And we all hope that the Geneva talks will resume. In the meantime, the protection of civilians mean that we have to engage the support of all of us here and outside. I pay tribute to the organisations such as the International Red Cross, Red Crescent, IRC, all represented here. They work with the United Nations and governments around the world to try to get access in areas, and sometimes, as we've heard today, it's impossible. So let's be blunt. The Assad regime is denying access to people who are desperately in need. The first duty of any government is to protect its own people. Where that doesn't happen, then we can step into support. But it is we who need to listen to the Syrian voices, and that was what was important about yesterday's NGO meetings, to listen to the Syrian voices about what help is needed, but also how we need it to ensure that when we give help, we ensure they have dignity. The empowerment is for them to decide. So for the majority of people in Syria who want peace, I say we are there to support. To those who want to continue to destroy Syria, I say we are there to support those who need help and to look to a peaceful future. And in doing that, we need to have the ability to provide stabilisation for the country so that it can have a stable government, it can have education, it can have health services, and it can also build a system of justice which can give, as Zainab Bangura said, the opportunity to show that impunity doesn't exist, that those who commit these grave offences now will one day face retribution, but decided by the Syrians themselves.
Thank you very much indeed, Baroness Anale. Thank you. Well, that really leads us now to our final session in this focused event on why we need to think about stabilisation and recovery in the various stages. So, Markus Ederer, you are effectively Deputy Foreign Minister of Germany with special responsibility for political affairs. So, if you could just make some brief introductory comments about this issue of stabilisation and recovery. And we have very little time, but there we go.
Thank you, Zainab. While we move from the bleak picture of protection, human rights, and humanitarian access to stabilization, I think we should ask ourselves one important question. How can we, the international community, together with the Syrians on the ground, become agents of hope, as Chancellor Merkel today put it, agents of change and agents for the future of Syria? And when you ask yourself that question, I think it can be broken down in different phases which we watch during the process. So the first question out of 3 is, what can we do today while all this is going on which has been described? How can we support Syrians in their daily struggle beyond humanitarian aid? How to preserve at least a minimum of local infrastructure, local services, small-scale economy, so that people actually have something to hold on to. And Anne was referring to the Syria Recovery Trust Fund, which is doing this, and I think we will hear Jan on similar situations in Iraq, and I think that's one of the questions. Second question, what do we do once the political process Baroness has referred to in Geneva, ceasefires, even local ceasefires, take hold? That's a different situation. And I would ask you, also speakers from the floor, when can we go in and what exactly do we have to do then? How can we support and consolidate even local peace, hopefully peace in the country overall at some point, with concrete measures on the ground? And how can we help IDPs, internally displaced persons, to return? And then in the third phase, from which we are still some steps away, how can we plan once we have a cessation of hostilities, once we have a political process, how can we provide for recovery and reconstruction? Can we already look at the needs today, which we will possibly be confronted with, both materially and financially? And is there any basis, any ongoing efforts which we do now, which can feed into that next situation? I think these are more or less the 3 big questions, and I would hope that with the contributions from the floor, we will have some answers at the end of that session.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Eder, for, because you're a PhD in law, I know, for setting out those kind of 3 phases for us. I think it sets the context very well for our subsequent interventions. Hani Khabbaz, you're Director General of the Syrian Recovery Trust Fund that we just heard referred to. Briefly, if you'd be so kind, as to, what can we build on? What kind of recovery can we build on in Syria?
Thank you, Zainab. Well, just to brief everyone first, the Syria Recovery Trust Fund is a multilateral trust fund supporting early recovery and essential services restoration inside Syria. Our interventions improve resilience of Syrians by restoring services, creating jobs, and combating to migration by doing all that. We've been able to make an impact inside Syria in several sectors, namely food security, health, education, water, agriculture, solid waste. Our many projects, over 26 right now, target over 2 million beneficiaries inside Syria again. To give you a few examples, in the food security, the SRTF has been working on restoring the cycle of bread production inside the country and providing the required inputs and equipment for that. In that intervention, we've been able to reduce the bread bundle price from 250 Syrian pounds to 125 Syrian pounds in the targeted area, benefiting over 100,000 people a day. In the health sector, we are supporting the medical capacities and healthcare services by restoring hospitals, supplying medications, medical equipment. So far, we've been able to provide access to primary healthcare to over 600,000 people. Our ambulances that were supplied by the SRTF serve over 50% of patients who use ambulances in Aleppo Governorate. In the health sector, in the electricity sector, we are executing 3 large projects that are for rehabilitation and expansion of main electricity grids and essential for livelihood of over 2 million Syrians. We're also working on stabilization efforts through our Filling the Void project, where we have pre-positioned essential equipment and supplies to respond to immediate needs in newly liberated areas. Our stabilization efforts are coordinated closely with the US, the UK, and the EU to complement and avoid any duplication. And we're looking forward to working closely with other players in this space. Finally, we will continue to do whatever we are possible today to do and stand ready to work with international community to scale up the efforts when the time comes to rebuild Syria. And in one word, I would like to say we are one of the agents of hope, I hope. Thank you.
Thank you so much indeed. If you'd be so kind as to pass the microphone to your neighbour there. Jan Kubiš, you are the Special Representative of the Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon for Iraq. Just very briefly give us a couple of kind of top lessons learned from stabilising Iraq.
Well, thank you very much. And indeed, I believe that the experience from Iraq is telling us that there can be gradual, small, but nevertheless successes in this otherwise very bleak situation that we face both in Iraq and in Syria. And to better understand what does it mean is also to understand what stabilization in Iraq means. It is a quick impact activity, both humanitarian but also political. It is not a long-term recovery, rehabilitation, reconstruction. It is indeed with objectives of returns, voluntary returns of IDPs in dignity, but also to strengthen governance, local governance, to strengthen law and order, and to empower the state to take over once again responsibility for law and order. And also it's a confidence building measure, notably from the perspective of community reconciliation, tribal reconciliation. We need it very much if we would like to have sustainable solutions, not only quick returns that would then create more and more problems. And because of this, the whole exercise is also full of risks. We must not forget that although this is partly a political exercise that should enable that the gains in the military campaign in Iraq are not squandered because of problems with returns, for example, or with reconciliation, it still must be following the basic humanitarian principles, including principles of protection. We need to manage expectations. Definitely, this is a short-term, about 3 months exercise with limited in scope and in time. It cannot replace rehabilitation, reconstruction, recovery. And in the case of Iraq, we must be very careful by promoting returns to liberated areas, not to, in a way, condone or be assisting in either by design or by default demographic changes. And I believe this is one of the lessons that also in Syria one must take into account. So what is happening in Iraq is not a model, it's a source of inspiration, but it is a good source of inspiration, and I'm aware that one is thinking about both Syria but also Libya, that indeed this model that is put in practice through a massive effort of notably UNDP, but the whole then humanitarian community can deliver as it is starting to deliver in Iraq. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed for those parallels, very useful indeed. Reem Turkmani, you are a research fellow here at the London School of Economics, but you're also a representative of civil society. What can civil society do now and then later on in reconstruction? Thank you.
Okay. Let me first put the view from our research at the LSE. The solution for Syria should not be confined to Geneva. It could well start here. The money that has been pledged by the donors could well take Syria into peace, or it could take it to more violence. That all depends on the strategy of spending. If it's put in the context of a strategy that transformed the well-established war economy into peace economy, then certainly all the spending should be and could be an internal, essential part of the solution. Lifting the coercive economic measures should also be part of the strategy right now. What we found out is that right now there is a very well-established war economy in Syria. The war is a mutual enterprise where the best interest of the parties is the continuation of the conflict and not the end of the conflict. And how do you break this enterprise? By bringing on the table those who want the end of the conflict, and those are the Syrian people. And who is there to represent the Syrian people, the Syrian agenda? It's the civil society. It's people like Fadi or Salma or Massa, those leaders who've always been absent from all the decision-making tables that relate to Syria. Those are the ones who have the Syrian public interest in mind, and therefore can help breaking this mutual enterprise and resolve the conflict. The other reason why we have to involve civil society is that in the middle of this chaos, to stabilize the country, you need a structure. And the only two emerging structure in the middle of the state collapse right now are the local administrative councils, which are stabilizing Syria, and the civil society. We need to support this structure as a new independent structure, not just give them money. Now help them to establish them to be their own independent institutions. The final reason why it's so essential to involve civil society is that the root of the Syrian crisis is political. And it is the civil society which still has the agenda of the Syrian revolution in heart, its rights and freedom. They are the ones who will bring those on the table. They are the ones who are going to talk about accountability. We'll talk about the laws that Mr. O'Brien spoke about. Without keeping this agenda on the table, looking into constitution, into looking how can we get into democratic transition. Without this, there will be no long-term solution to the crisis. So my last call is that that have been great experience in this conference, but there should be no more events related to Syria without the Syrian civil society on the table.
Thank you very much indeed, Reem. Thank you. We can go now to Yaqub Al-Hilu. You are the United Nations Resident Humanitarian Coordinator and special designated official inside Syria. You've spent quite a long time there now, so you know what's going on in there. So please give us your perspective.
Thank you, Zainab. First of all, I salute all the Syrians in the room, and through them, all the Syrians in Syria and in the world. I thank the United Kingdom and the co-hosts for bringing us here and creating this opportunity for us also to learn as we move forward how best we can do. You asked a question earlier, Zainab, what can we build on as we move forward, as we look into the future, stabilizing but rebuilding this icon of a country. There's a lot to build on, and I think the most valuable asset that we must build on are the Syrian people themselves. These are people who are in love with their country. In fact, the good news is that the majority of the Syrian people in the world today are still in Syria, and if they have not given up, we have no right to give up. None of us has the right to give up. So as we seize opportunities like London today, and as we look into the future starts today.